The summer of 1565 marked one of the most dramatic confrontations in Mediterranean history, an event that many historians regard as a turning point in the struggle between Christian Europe and the expanding Ottoman Empire. Known as the Siege of Malta, this brutal clash brought together an army of approximately 40,000 Ottoman soldiers against a vastly outnumbered garrison of around 700 Knights Hospitaller and a few thousand local defenders. What unfolded was not merely a military conflict but a test of endurance, faith, and willpower that echoed throughout Europe and the Islamic world. To understand the true weight of this siege, one must look not only at the numbers but also at the spirit of both sides, for the contest was as much about ideological supremacy as it was about possession of a rocky island in the Mediterranean. The Knights Hospitaller, also known as the Order of St. John, had been forced from Rhodes in 1522 after a grueling siege by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. Driven from their island stronghold, they eventually found refuge on Malta, granted to them by Charles V of Spain. Though Malta was little more than a barren rock, its position was strategically crucial, lying on the sea routes between the Ottoman-controlled territories and the western Mediterranean. For Suleiman, Malta was more than an annoyance, it was a dagger pointed at the lifeline of his empire. The Knights had developed a reputation for raiding Ottoman shipping, capturing valuable cargoes, and disrupting trade. This humiliation could not be tolerated indefinitely. Thus, when the Ottoman court debated their next expansion, the decision to strike at Malta seemed both logical and necessary. The defenders of Malta were led by Jean Parasset de Villette, the Grand Master of the Order, a seasoned warrior who had spent decades fighting the Ottomans. At 70 years old, he embodied resilience and determination. Under his command were not only the 700 knights but also several thousand Maltese militia and some Spanish and Italian soldiers who had pledged to assist. In total, estimates place the defenders at around 6,000 to 9,000, a fraction of the massive force Suleiman dispatched. Yet what the defenders lacked in numbers they made up for in fortifications, discipline, and the knowledge that there was no retreat. For the knights, surrender meant death or enslavement. For the Maltese civilians, it meant the destruction of their homes and families. The stakes could not have been higher. The Ottoman armada that appeared off Malta in May 1565 was a sight that struck terror into the hearts of all who saw it. Hundreds of ships carrying tens of thousands of soldiers, including janissaries, cavalry, artillery units, and auxiliary troops, filled the horizon. The force was commanded by Lala Mustafa Pasha, with the famous corsair Dragut Reis, known to Christians as Turgut, providing naval expertise. Their confidence was understandable. With such overwhelming numbers, the fall of Malta seemed inevitable. In the Ottoman camp, victory was assumed to be only a matter of time, perhaps weeks, before the Knights were crushed under the weight of the empire. The siege began with bombardments on the key strongholds of Birgu and Fort St. Elmo. Street. Elmo guarded the entrance to the Grand Harbor, and its fall was essential for Ottoman control of the seas around Malta. The defenders knew this and resolved to hold it at all costs. Day after day, Ottoman cannons thundered against the fort's walls, reducing stone to rubble. The janissaries launched wave after wave of assaults, expecting the defenders to collapse under the pressure. Yet the Knights and their allies resisted with a ferocity that stunned the attackers. Accounts tell of men fighting until the last breath, hurling burning oil, rocks, and gunfire at enemies scaling the walls. Even when mortally wounded, defenders clung to their posts, preferring death to surrender. By the time St. Elmo finally fell in late June, nearly every defender had been killed. But their sacrifice was not in vain. The small garrison had held out for nearly a month, far longer than the Ottomans anticipated, buying precious time for Birgu and Sengele to strengthen their defenses. The fall of Fort St. Elmo came at a heavy cost for the Ottomans. Thousands of their soldiers had been killed in repeated assaults. Among the dead was Dragut Reis, their greatest naval commander, slain by shrapnel from cannon fire. His death was a severe blow to Ottoman morale. The defenders, though devastated by the loss of their comrades at St. Elmo, were emboldened by the realization that the enemy could be bled. Villette ordered that the bodies of the knights be buried with honor, while the heads of fallen janissaries were fired back into the Ottoman camp by cannon, a brutal reminder that the siege would be fought with merciless determination. The battle shifted toward Birgu and Sengele, where the main body of defenders braced for the storm. The Ottomans brought up massive artillery, pounding the walls day and night. The thunder of cannons was constant, the air thick with smoke and dust. Ottoman engineers attempted to undermine the walls, while waves of infantry attacked the breaches. At times, it seemed certain the defenses would crumble. But the knights fought with a discipline forged by years of warfare, rallying at each breach, repelling assaults with sword, musket, and pike. Maltese civilians, too, joined in the defense, carrying water, ammunition, and even taking up arms when needed. Women tended the wounded, extinguished fires, and sometimes fought alongside the men when the walls were nearly overrun. The entire population of Malta became part of the defense, united in desperation and faith. As the summer wore on, the siege turned into a nightmare of attrition. The Ottomans suffered under the relentless Maltese sun, their supply lines strained. Disease and exhaustion spread through their ranks. The defenders, too, were worn down, their numbers dwindling with each assault. Food and water grew scarce, and the wounded filled makeshift hospitals where the smell of death was inescapable. Yet morale remained unbroken. Valette moved constantly among his men, encouraging them, reminding them of their duty, and inspiring them with his personal courage. On more than one occasion, he fought on the front lines, wielding his sword against the enemy. His leadership became a symbol of defiance, a beacon for men who had every reason to despair but refused to surrender. The Ottomans launched several major assaults, each one designed to deliver the final blow. In one dramatic attack, they constructed a massive floating bridge to cross into Sengala, attempting to overwhelm the defenses from the sea. But the defenders, aided by a small flotilla of Maltese boats and fire ships, managed to destroy the bridge and repel the assault. In another, they brought their full force against Birgu, breaching the walls and surging into the town. For a moment, it seemed that all was lost, but the knights counterattacked with savage ferocity, driving the invaders back into chaos. Each time the Ottomans believed victory was within reach, the defenders clawed it back from the brink. By September, the siege had dragged on far longer than anticipated. Ottoman casualties were enormous, estimated at tens of thousands. Supplies dwindled, and the army's morale sank. The defenders, though battered and bloodied, still held their ground. Then came the news that a relief force was finally on its way from Sicily, composed of Spanish and Italian troops. Though smaller than expected, the arrival of these reinforcements tipped the balance. The exhausted Ottoman army, unable to continue the fight, began to withdraw. What had been assumed to be a swift and inevitable victory had turned into a costly and humiliating failure. The lifting of the siege was celebrated across Europe as a triumph of Christian resistance. The Knights Hospitaller had stood against overwhelming odds and prevailed, their reputation cemented as one of the most formidable military orders of the age. The Ottoman Empire, though still powerful, had suffered a blow to its prestige. The failure at Malta marked a turning point, demonstrating that the Ottomans were not invincible and inspiring resistance in other parts of Europe. The psychological impact of the siege was profound, shaping the course of Mediterranean politics for decades to come. For Malta, the siege became a defining moment in its history. The bravery of the knights and the Maltese people forged a legacy of resilience that endures to this day. The island was transformed into a fortress, with new defenses constructed under the guidance of military engineers. The memory of 1565 was etched into the identity of Malta, celebrated as a symbol of sacrifice and victory against impossible odds. For the knights, the siege solidified their role as defenders of Christendom, and though their political power would eventually wane, their glory at Malta ensured their place in history. The Siege of Malta was more than just a military confrontation. It was a battle of civilizations, a clash of faiths, and a struggle for supremacy in the Mediterranean. 700 knights, supported by a few thousand allies, had faced 40,000 soldiers of the mightiest empire of the age. The blood that soaked the rocky soil of Malta in 1565 was not shed in vain. It changed the trajectory of history, halting the Ottoman advance and proving that courage, unity, and determination could overcome overwhelming force. The story of the siege remains one of the most dramatic and inspiring episodes of the early modern era, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit when faced with impossible odds. The background of the Knights Hospitaller after their expulsion from Rhodes and settlement on Malta. The Knights Hospitaller, also known as the Order of St. John, had been a powerful military and religious order since the Crusades. They originally controlled the island of Rhodes, where they established a formidable naval base and fortress, but in 1522 they were expelled after a brutal siege by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. Left without a home, they searched for a new base from which they could continue their mission of defending Christendom against the Ottoman threat. In 1530, Charles V of Spain granted them Malta, a rocky, arid island with little in the way of resources but an excellent strategic position in the Mediterranean. Though Malta was a far cry from Rhodes in terms of wealth and fertility, the Knights quickly recognized its value. They fortified harbors, built defenses, and transformed it into a bastion of resistance against Ottoman expansion, setting the stage for the Great Siege of 1565. The strategic importance of Malta in the Mediterranean for both Christians and Ottomans. Malta's significance lay not in its size or resources but in its location. Situated in the central Mediterranean, it served as a crossroads between Europe and North Africa and between the eastern and western seas. For the Ottomans, who controlled vast territories in the Middle East and North Africa, Malta was a thorn in their side, threatening trade and military routes. For the Knights, Malta offered the perfect base for launching raids against Ottoman shipping, disrupting supply lines, and protecting Christian interests. Control of Malta would allow the Ottomans to dominate the western Mediterranean and potentially threaten Italy and Spain. Conversely, its defense was essential to preserving the balance of power in the region. Thus, the struggle for Malta was not about the island's barren landscape but about its role as a gatekeeper of the Mediterranean, a role that magnified its importance far beyond its modest geography. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent's decision to attack Malta and crush the Knights. By the mid-16th century, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent had established himself as the most powerful ruler in the world. His empire stretched from Hungary to Arabia, from North Africa to the Persian Gulf. Yet despite his vast conquests, the defiance of the Knights Hospitaller rankled him deeply. Their raids against Ottoman merchant vessels and naval convoys caused disruption, loss of wealth, and humiliation to the empire's prestige. After their expulsion from Rhodes, Suleiman had allowed them to survive, but their continued harassment made their destruction a necessity. In 1565, Suleiman decided the time had come to end their threat once and for all. His advisors assured him that Malta, a small island defended by a few thousand men, could be taken quickly. Confident of victory, he dispatched a massive armada under the command of Lala Mustafa Pasha and Dragut Reis, setting the stage for one of history's most dramatic sieges. The overwhelming Ottoman invasion force of around 40,000 men and hundreds of ships. The army assembled by the Ottomans for the Malta expedition was one of the largest ever seen in the Mediterranean. Contemporary sources estimate that around 40,000 men were gathered, though numbers vary between 30,000 and 50,000 depending on accounts. This included elite Janissary infantry, cavalry units, artillerymen, sappers, and thousands of auxiliary soldiers drawn from across the empire. The fleet itself consisted of nearly 200 war galleys, along with transports carrying supplies, horses, and siege equipment. For the defenders watching from the shores of Malta, the sight of the armada on the horizon was terrifying, an endless line of sails and oars stretching across the sea. The Ottomans were confident in their numerical superiority. By comparison, the Knights had only about 700 brothers of the order, along with a few thousand Maltese militia and foreign allies. On paper, the contest appeared hopelessly one-sided. Grand Master Jean Parasit de Vilette's leadership and determination to defend the island. Jean Parasit de Vilette, the Grand Master of the Knights Hospitaller, was 70 years old at the time of the siege, yet his vigor and resolve inspired his men. A veteran of countless battles against the Ottomans, Vilette was both a seasoned warrior and a shrewd commander. He understood that Malta could not rely on immediate outside help. Sicily and Spain might eventually send reinforcements, but the island had to withstand the storm on its own for as long as possible. Vilette prepared by strengthening the fortifications, stockpiling supplies, and instilling discipline among his forces. His leadership style was direct. He shared in the hardships of his men, often appearing on the walls during battles and even fighting alongside them. His unwavering refusal to consider surrender, even in the darkest hours, gave the defenders a sense of unity and purpose that proved critical to their survival. The defense of Fort St. Elmo and the heroic sacrifice of its garrison. Fort St. Elmo, a small star-shaped fortress guarding the entrance to the Grand Harbor, became the first major target of the Ottoman onslaught. The Ottomans understood that controlling this fort would give them naval dominance around Malta, making it easier to besiege the main towns. The garrison of St. Elmo, numbering only a few hundred men, faced an incessant bombardment from heavy artillery. Walls crumbled, rubble filled the courtyards, and assaults came daily. Yet the defenders fought with unmatched tenacity, repelling wave after wave of attackers. Despite pleas to abandon the fort when it became untenable, the knights and soldiers resolved to fight to the last. After nearly a month, St. Elmo fell, but almost every defender perished in the struggle. Their sacrifice bought valuable time for Burgu and Sengele to prepare, and their valor became a symbol of the knights' determination to resist against all odds. The death of Ottoman Admiral Dragut Reis during the siege and its impact on morale. Among the Ottoman commanders, Dragut Reis was perhaps the most feared and respected. A legendary corsair and admiral, he had struck terror into Christian shipping for decades and was considered the empire's most brilliant naval strategist. His presence at Malta greatly boosted Ottoman confidence, as many believed he could ensure victory. However, during the heavy bombardments of Fort St. Elmo, Dragut was struck by flying shrapnel from cannon fire. He lingered for days but eventually succumbed to his wounds. His death was a devastating blow to the Ottoman leadership and morale. Soldiers who revered him as invincible were shaken, while commanders lost one of their most capable tacticians. In contrast, the defenders took inspiration from the news. The fall of Dragut was seen as divine intervention, a sign that God favored their cause. The siege continued with renewed ferocity, but a sense of doubt had crept into the Ottoman ranks. The relentless bombardment and assaults on Burgu and Sengele by Ottoman forces. After the fall of Fort St. Elmo, the Ottomans turned their attention to Burgu and Sengele, the main centers of resistance. For weeks, heavy artillery bombarded the walls, reducing bastions to rubble and creating breaches for infantry assaults. The defenders lived under constant thunder, with cannonballs smashing through stone and splintering buildings. The Ottomans launched massive coordinated attacks, sending waves of janissaries to storm the breaches. Hand-to-hand combat ensued, with swords, pikes, and muskets used in brutal close quarters. Time and again, the defenders rallied, driving the attackers back despite being outnumbered. The Maltese militia fought alongside the knights, while women and children carried supplies and tended the wounded. Fires broke out, and exhaustion was constant, yet the defenders held firm. The siege became a grinding war of attrition, testing the endurance of both sides. Still, the Ottomans could not deliver the decisive blow they needed. The role of Maltese civilians in supporting and even fighting alongside the knights. The siege was not fought solely by the Knights Hospitaller. The Maltese people, though lacking formal military training, played a vital role in the defense of their homeland. Men joined the militia, manned walls, and carried weapons into battle. Women supported tirelessly by tending to the wounded, bringing water to the front lines, and extinguishing fires caused by Ottoman bombardments. In desperate moments, even civilians took up arms, fighting shoulder to shoulder with the knights to repel assaults. Their knowledge of the terrain proved valuable for reinforcing defenses and improvising fortifications. Civilians also endured immense suffering, as their homes were destroyed and their families lived under constant threat of massacre if the Ottomans broke through. Yet their loyalty never wavered. The unity between the knights and Maltese civilians transformed the siege into not only a military struggle but a collective fight for survival, forging a lasting bond between people and order. The failed Ottoman attempt to invade Sengele using a massive floating bridge. One of the most dramatic moments of the siege came when the Ottomans attempted a bold assault on Sengele by sea. They constructed a massive floating bridge, designed to carry soldiers across the water and directly into the heart of the defenses. Supported by naval bombardments, thousands of troops began advancing across the structure, aiming to overwhelm the defenders from an unexpected direction. But the plan faltered under fierce resistance. The knights launched small boats armed with cannons and fire ships, crashing into the bridge and setting it ablaze. Arrows, musket fire, and artillery rained down on the attackers, creating chaos. The bridge collapsed under the assault, and hundreds of Ottoman soldiers drowned or were slain. The failure not only cost lives but also shattered the aura of Ottoman invincibility. For the defenders, it was a moment of triumph, proving that ingenuity and courage could defeat even the grandest of enemy plans. The brutal hand-to-hand combat during repeated breaches of the walls of Burgu. The fighting at Burgu was among the most savage of the siege. After relentless bombardment, the Ottomans repeatedly stormed the walls through breaches blasted open by cannon fire. Each time, they expected the defenders to collapse, yet each time they were met with ferocious resistance. Knights in heavy armor wielded swords and axes, while Maltese militia fought with pikes, knives, and improvised weapons. The narrow breaches became killing grounds, where piles of bodies clogged the way forward. Defenders hurled rocks, poured boiling oil, and fired muskets at point-blank range. The cries of the wounded mingled with the clash of steel, creating scenes of almost unimaginable brutality. Even when attackers managed to push into the town, counterattacks drove them out in bloody melees. These clashes drained Ottoman manpower while demonstrating the defenders' resolve. For the inhabitants of Burgu, every day became a fight for survival, with no room for weakness or hesitation. The devastating toll of disease, heat, and exhaustion on both sides during the long summer siege. The Mediterranean summer of 1565 was merciless. Under the blazing sun, both sides suffered terribly. The Ottomans, camped in exposed positions, endured heat, thirst, and disease. Dysentery and fever spread through their crowded encampments, weakening morale and cutting down soldiers without a shot fired. Supplies, already stretched thin, became harder to maintain as the siege dragged on. The defenders, too, faced exhaustion. Food grew scarce, water ran low, and the wounded filled makeshift hospitals where conditions were dire. The smell of rot and death permeated the air, while the constant bombardment deprived many of rest. Yet despite their misery, the defenders endured, fueled by faith and determination. For the Ottomans, the attritional grind wore away their initial confidence. The longer the siege continued, the greater the strain became. Ultimately, disease and exhaustion proved as deadly as swords and cannons, shaping the outcome of the struggle as much as combat itself. The unexpected arrival of the Sicilian relief force in September. Throughout the siege, the defenders hoped desperately for aid from Europe. Their main expectation was that the Viceroy of Sicily, Don Garcia de Toledo, would send reinforcements. Yet months passed with no help arriving, as political hesitation and logistical difficulties delayed action. By September, the situation seemed dire. Then, news arrived that a relief force had finally set sail. Though smaller than originally hoped, numbering perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 men, its impact was enormous. As the force landed and marched toward the Ottoman lines, the exhausted besiegers realized they faced fresh enemies. Skirmishes erupted, and the Ottomans, already battered by months of failure and disease, began to retreat. The arrival of reinforcements boosted Maltese morale immeasurably, while the Ottomans' spirit broke. What might have been a final chance for victory turned into a humiliating withdrawal, as the Great Armada sailed away in defeat, leaving Malta scarred but unconquered. The Ottoman retreat after suffering massive casualties and failing to take Malta. By the time the siege ended, the Ottoman army had suffered staggering losses. Estimates vary, but some accounts suggest that as many as 20,000 to 30,000 men had been killed through combat, disease, and attrition. The once confident invaders left behind heaps of dead and broken equipment. The knights, though victorious, had also endured severe casualties. Nearly half their number were slain, and Malta lay devastated. Yet the critical fact remained. The Ottomans had failed. For an empire that had seemed unstoppable, this was a shocking reversal. The retreat marked one of the rare moments in the 16th century when Ottoman expansion had been checked decisively. It was not merely a military failure but a blow to imperial prestige. Christian Europe celebrated the news with joy, recognizing the siege as a turning point in the struggle for the Mediterranean. For Suleiman, the defeat was a bitter humiliation that he would not live to avenge. The lasting impact of the siege on European morale, Ottoman prestige, and the course of Mediterranean history. The Siege of Malta had consequences far beyond the island itself. For Europe, it became a symbol of resilience and divine favor. The victory of a tiny garrison against overwhelming odds inspired confidence that the Ottoman advance could be resisted. It galvanized Christian states to take a firmer stand, paving the way for future clashes such as the naval battle of Lepanto in 1571. For the Ottomans, the defeat undermined the aura of invincibility they had cultivated over decades of conquest. Though still powerful, they were forced to reconsider the limits of their expansion. For Malta, the siege became a defining chapter in national identity, remembered as a time when the people and the knights stood together against annihilation. The bloodshed of 1565 altered the trajectory of Mediterranean politics, reminding both empires and small nations alike that determination and courage could change the course of history.